Joining me today is Elbridge Colby. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development in the Trump administration. He was one of the key DoD officials involved in crafting the 2018 National Defense Strategy and the author of the Strategy of Denial, which also, like the defense strategy, focuses in many parts on how to counter China's rise. And he's also the co-founder of the Marathon Initiative. And yeah, just to get into this, maybe you can give us a quick overview over why Asia and China matter so much now for US policy, or should matter even more in your opinion.
Sure. Well, thanks. Well, great to be with you, Sebastian, and to speak to your audience. I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward, even simple, which is that, Asia is what Winston Churchill called the decisive theater. I mean, it's a concept that's very familiar in strategic thinking, which is that Asia now is the largest proportion of global economic productivity measured by GDP or what have you, and that fraction will increase over time. So I think it's approaching 50%, and in the future it'll be over 50%. And then, China is by far the most powerful state in the international system, other than the United States itself. It's 10 times the GDP of Russia. And, depending on how you measure it, roughly equivalent to the United States. If you use dollar-denominated market terms, it's less. If you use purchasing power parity, it's actually larger than the United States, larger industrial base, et cetera. So, that's why I've been making this point for a number of years. There are a lot of Europeans who object to it, but I have not seen really a compelling response. The one, probably the most sophisticated counter I've heard to that point is that the United States and Europe are tightly netted together economically. But that's not, I mean, that's valuable. I think it underscores the importance of Europe. Europe is important to the United States in a secondary way. Its total share of global GDP is declining precipitously. According to the EU, it's going to be at 10% within, I think, about 20 years. But also the concern is it has less to do with tight interconnection here and our direct exposure, rather than China's ability, if it dominated the world's largest market economic area, that it would have enormous leverage to reshape market flows. It would obviously have direct control, hegemonic sort of control over Asia, which would, of course, affect the United States directly, given increasing U.S. investment in Asia and reliance on Asia for imports and so forth. But also China could use that economic heft to reshape, Middle Eastern, European, and Latin American trade flows towards itself. So that's why Asia is more important. Obviously, the United States and Europe share long history, although that history is a little more complicated than often appreciated. The United States in the 19th century was an isolationist state, but isolationism referred to actually Europe. The United States did not participate directly in European affairs, but it was actually quite active in Asian affairs. So it has been active in Asian and Latin American affairs, particularly Caribbean and Central America, since the beginning of the Republic.
And focusing in, can you talk a little bit about why, in your view, Taiwan is such an important point? Because in the West, or particularly in Europe, but also in the US, I'd say many politicians talk about Taiwan's importance, or the scenario of Taiwan being invaded, in terms of defending democracy or the semiconductor industry, right? Yeah. And you take a different approach, and you just can you explain why?
Sure. Yeah, Taiwan is important because Asia and China are important, and Taiwan is critical from a military and geopolitical point of view to the successful functioning of what I call the anti-hegemonic coalition, essentially a balancing coalition that would be very familiar from European history, designed to prevent an aspiring hegemon from dominating the continent. So the most familiar are obviously the coalitions in the First and Second World Wars against Germany, or if you go back to an earlier era, against Napoleonic and Bourbon France, for instance. Essentially coalitions defined not by their common values, actually, but by their shared common opposition to that aspiring hegemon. So the United States made a common cause with Joseph Stalin in the Second World War. You had Republican France and Tsarist Russia on the same side in the First World War. You go back to liberal England and absolutist Prussia making common cause against the revolutionary France, etc. So that's the basic idea, and Taiwan is very important for that. The fact that Taiwan is a democracy is commendable, and they deserve to be applauded for that. But I don't think lots of Americans should be put into the, God forbid, harm's way purely to defend somebody else's democracy, especially when they're not defending their own democracy very robustly. Rather, the reason Taiwan is so important is because if China were able to subsume Taiwan, it would break out of the first island chain militarily, which would enable its further power projection, and it would cause significant doubts, reasoned and well-grounded doubts on the part of regional Asian states about the reliability and strength of the United States relative to the threat of China, which could lead to bandwagoning or accommodating behavior. So think of it as, in the historical context, you might think of it as akin to kind of Belgium, a state that has an importance well above itself because of its geography, and of course the semiconductors issue adds on top of that.
Yeah, and especially this reliability part is something that in Europe is now often used, like when European leaders talk about Taiwan, they often like to compare it now to Ukraine, and basically make the argument that the United States itself needs to deter Russia in Ukraine, to deter China from invading Taiwan. And yeah, I think, and in Europe, obviously also the argument or the experience in Ukraine is that they decided to impose sanctions and then deliver weapons once the war began. And I think a lot of those things don't work in Taiwan, and it's, yeah, if you can just explain the key difference.
Yeah, look, the argument about the connection of Ukraine to Taiwan is, I understand why European leaders make it, because it serves their interests. I just don't think it's true. I mean, look, I in my book, I lay out a argument for the way that credibility matters. I do think credibility matters in human affairs, and certainly war and peace. It matters in the United States. If you want to get a house, you take out a mortgage and they ask for a credit report. So obviously credibility matters, but it's more contextual. The common refrain you hear from European leaders right now is that everything's connected. If you don't stop Putin in Ukraine, that Xi Jinping will go into, and many American leaders too, will go into Taiwan. I don't think that's at all the primary or even secondary factor. The primary factor is going to be the military balance relative to, Taiwan, and the level of American resolve and Japanese and Taiwanese resolve to defend themselves. And that, of course, trades against the effort in Ukraine. Not to say that the effort in Ukraine isn't important. It is important, and it's a just cause. The Ukrainians are fighting a just defense. That's not the issue. The way I think about it, the way you can invalidate that contention is to say that if it were true that the fate of Taiwan were going to be resolved in Ukraine, China would be much more directly involved. I mean, China would probably send military forces, because China, clearly cares enormously about Taiwan, right? In fact, it cares more about Taiwan than any other state in the international system. So if it were true, then we would see Chinese troops fighting the Ukrainians. But of course, you don't see that at all. In fact, what you see is the Chinese behaving as I would expect, which is trying to essentially perpetuate the war, support the Russians without paying the full price, and trying to shift the balance of forces and balance of resolve in its favor in the local context. So I think that's, and I think we have harmed our position in the Pacific through our overemphasis on Ukraine. Some weapons, direct weapons trade-offs, but more the money that we've sent, the political will of the American people. I mean, right now we're having a huge discussion in the United States about the border. Ukraine, $60 billion going to Ukraine, a small fraction of that potentially going to Asia. We're not exactly even clear how much. So obviously the priority of this administration and a number of Republicans, particularly in the Senate, is to put Ukraine first, which is a mistake. Again, not because the Ukrainian cause isn't just or important, but because we have a more important problem. So, I guess my advice to Europeans at this point is I think that line is, I mean, it convinces some people. I think it's less and less sort of compelling and effective. I think if, as Napoleon said, if you want to take Vienna, take Vienna. And my view is if you want to deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan, focus on deterring a Chinese attack on Taiwan.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Pretty common sense, I mean, honestly.
Speaking about the administrations here, that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because you served in the Trump administration. You were, I think, very heavily involved in the national defense strategy there, and you're on the right, probably one of the most prominent foreign policy voices in terms of this China issue. And I think I've even seen it was Ron DeSantis mentioned the strategy of denial on the debate stage. So I'd say if there's going to be a Republican administration, it's probably going to be Trump. And in that case, your point of view, your strategy, the US strategy might more align with that. I think that's you could likely say that. And so the thing I want to ask you is, what would that mean if your strategy is implemented, your proposed strategy? What would that mean for Europe, for the US presence in Europe? And just explain what the American expectation then is from its European allies.
Sure. Well, look, I wouldn't make any claims about my own influence or presume that I would be in some position of responsibility. What I will say is that I think that my strategy is the most consistent with the agenda of America First, which is, as many people say, America First is not America alone. It's not America isolated. It's not America burying its head in the sand, but it's also not the same old business. It's not the foreign policy of George W. Bush. So I think it's, frankly, again, it's common sense. In Germany, I think it's pretty unremarkable for German politicians to be saying, well, is this in the interests of the German voter, or in Japan or France or Italy? And that's sort of become controversial in the United States over the last generation, which is absurd. But anyway, we're going back to basics here. So the question is kind of, what does America First mean in this broad political coalition that's kind of reform Republicans or new right or whatever you want to call it? And my view is that not mine, but the foreign policy that I am advocating for is a reasonable middle course that would should appeal to Republican politicians in that vein, which is you can't do what I think has best been referred to as the primicists, the people who think that we're still in 1999, that China's 1/10 our economic scale, that we can go around bombing people willy-nilly without concern. We can throw money around like it's nobody's problem. Obviously not true. Our defense industrial base is in bad shape. Jay Powell yesterday said that the debt is becoming a really serious issue here. People are very concerned about it. We got border problems. We have recruiting issues in our military. And by the way, China's the biggest peer competitor we've ever faced. It's much bigger than Nazi or Imperial Germany or the Soviet Union relative to the United States. So we're in a totally different league. So the primicists are living in yesterday, and they're like the managers of a company who pretend that it's it's like GM pretending it's 1970 when they're having their lunch eaten by Honda and Toyota in 1985. They're going to lead us to the shoals, right into the iceberg. So we need to change from that. On the other hand, you can't just pull back from the world. There's a lot of nasty people out there. There's a lot of people who are looking to pursue their own interests, and if they can get away with it, they will. And of course, that's human nature. That's history shows that. So you can't do this isolationist thing and pull back from everywhere. So the middle course to me is this, strategy of denial, or whatever you want to call it, which is focused on denying and going back in a sense to the kind of core American foreign policy, which in a sense is similar to traditional British foreign policy relative to the European continent, which is denying any state the ability to dominate a key region. And of course, there's the most important region being Asia, followed by Europe. It's different 70 years ago when all the big economies were in Europe. Then it was the most important. Now it's Asia. Things change. Middle East, a distant third, especially the Gulf. And looking at the world, you say, well, in Asia, you've got by far the biggest rival to the United States and China, 10 times the size of Russia. You got the most important market area. And then when you dig a little deeper, you find that China's roughly 50% of Asian GDP, and it's a classic central power. So it has the position of Imperial Germany, but magnified greatly. I mean, it's much larger. So it has both the advantages and the disadvantages of a central power, but it means it can move out on various different axes. And of course, now it's backed resolutely by Russia, Putin's Russia. So that's an area where the internal balancing capabilities of the Asian states is very limited. If the United States did not play what I call in my book the role of the external cornerstone balancer, there's a very good chance that coalition would fail and China would achieve its hegemonic aims. Meantime, in Europe, Russia is not even the largest economy in Europe, if you use market terms. And the EU or NATO, depending on how you define it, dwarfs the Russian economy, even a militarized Russian economy. If the Europeans put their mind to it, they could readily balance Russian military power. And the thing that puts some of the edge into my rhetoric towards Europe is a couple of things. One is to imbue a sense of urgency, because obviously Europeans have been ignoring the Americans for decades, right? I mean, obviously, Robert Gates gave a speech 10 years ago, politely listened to, totally ignored. Barack Obama said things, basically ignored. Donald Trump got results in terms of European defense spending, but we aren't where we need to be. Joe Biden went back to the old way of being nice, not where we need to be. And the fact of the matter, and this is the thing, this is not personality driven. The facts of the matter are that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have the same, what's called the force planning construct of the Department of Defense. It tells you what kind of military you build. It's focused on trying to beat the Chinese, which we're not confident that we could do, not being able to fight simultaneous wars. So if a war breaks out in Asia, we have to focus there. That's going to leave Europe vulnerable even more. In my view, if a war broke out in Europe first, including a war over NATO, we would have to withhold capabilities because we could not, if we didn't, we would expend them and commit them, and then the Chinese would be crazy not to attack Taiwan. And the historical analogy I use here is that, as the Anglo-French forces were collapsing in the Battle of France in 1940, Churchill, the French were begging for more help from Britain. Churchill wanted to send more Spitfires and Hurricanes to help, and the Royal Air Force said, if you do that, we won't be able to defend Britain itself. So, at some point, no matter what the rhetoric is, nobody doubted Churchill's commitment to helping defeat the Nazis, but you got to make a prudential judgment. And so, Europe's got it. So part of it is the urgency. And the second part is particularly with Germans, and I'm a great admirer of German culture and so forth, and Germany and its history and so forth. Most of it is, and I know that you can do better. Like, I know it's hard, but we are all paying 3% of our GDP on 3% of my income doesn't go to my kids or whatever, or my healthcare. It goes to paying for defense of our allies. It's not like we're not worried about a Russian invasion of North Dakota. During the Cold War, after World War II, after the Nazi atrocities and aggression, West Germany had an incredibly formidable military. It had 12 active divisions in 1988 and 3 in ready reserve. It had a huge tactical air force. It was the backbone of the NATO kind of theater military posture. That was living memory. That was, 35 years ago. Germany dismantled its military due to the peace dividend for reasons that I can understand intellectually. Thomas Baga has written about this in Germany Embraced the End of History. That's done. It's over. It's an explanation, not an excuse. Everybody has difficult challenges. We have a difficult challenge. We're dealing with a peer adversary for the first time in our history in a lot of ways, or at least for the last 100+ years. So Germany needs to change. And obviously, Germany and Europe did not respond to, we understand, we don't want to push you too hard. We tried it, didn't work. Now we got to try something sharper. And those people who are not pushing you in that direction are not doing you any favors, because the realities that I'm talking about are structural, and they will exist whoever wins the election in 2024 or 2028 or 2032. And if you're not ready, excuse me, you're going to be exposed. And I don't want you to be exposed, but as the famous Italian novel puts it, things must change to stay the same.
Yeah, in Germany, we had what is called Zeitenwende, changing times.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Yeah, that's my point. Where it was promised, yeah, now we will spend 2% of our GDP as promised since decades ago, but still this hasn't materialized, and also the defense production, I don't think that it's at the levels which it would be required if considering, yeah, if Germany were to take over some responsibilities from that the US has in terms of Ukraine. What I found interesting, and you mentioned this a little bit in your book, you mentioned favorably the strategy of the Bundeswehr, of the West German military in the 80s, and talk about it as well. And yeah, that this at that time it's a positive example that it was working as it should in a strategy of denying Russia or then the Soviet Union. What would today, how large, just in simple terms, for example, when it comes to personnel or I don't know, tanks, in very simple term, how large should the German military be in your view?
I don't know. I mean, my argument is, and my approach is like, let's get the strategy, let's figure out what we need, not only in some very macro generic sense, but at the military strategy level, because strategy of denial refers to the geopolitical goal. Germany also presumably shares an interest in preventing Russia from dominating the continent. I talk about the possibility of Germany potentially excuse me, rejuvenating its historic claim. I think it's obviously very unlikely, but we have to take some account of it. But I think that's a manageable problem. But also, strategy of denial refers to the military strategy problem, which is denial, essentially what the 1980s Bundeswehr was talking about. And one of the finest strategic documents I think ever been produced that I've come across, the 1983 German Defense White Paper, which is an extremely sophisticated treatment. I mean, I only read it in English, must be even better in German. Treatment of the Soviet military threat, but also how that had coercive political ramifications, and that was a lot of what was going on. Obviously, there was certainly understanding that a war could break out, but there was also a fear that the Soviets would try to Finlandize West Germany and kind of rent-seek off it to prop up their model and their Soviet empire. Excuse me, sorry. I think what you need to be able to do. I mean, to me, Germany's moral obligation is not pacifism, obviously. I mean, Heiko Maas goes around talking, he used to go around talking about people power. Like, look, people power played a role, but at the end of the day, the Soviets saw a wall of primarily German and American troops and a lot of nuclear weapons and decided it wasn't worth trying. And then fortunately, Gorbachev and solidarity and other things brought the system down from within, but you needed that wall. And so nobody benefited more from NATO collective defense than West Germany. And, by historic, I mean, the countries that had a stronger moral claim on such benefits suffered under Soviet, enslavement, essentially occupation for like Poland for 40 years. It seems to me it's in some of the discussion of the Zeitenwende, excuse me, has emphasized that part of the reason why it hasn't really materialized as quickly, although Minister of Defense Pistorius seems like an improvement, but is that Germany hasn't felt as much of a direct threat. And I try not to be too of a tub thumper, but like, of all countries, Germany should have some sense of collective obligation, right? That would seem to be, I mean, for a country that prides itself on being a moral leader. I mean, you had Angela Merkel literally travel to our country and say that she is the leader of the free world. Okay, well, let's see some follow through. I think that even if Germany is not directly threatened, and I think that's probably right, by Russian ground forces, the countries of the East that are its neighbors, Poland, the Baltic states, obviously Ukraine, Finland, they are directly threatened, and the Russian military will become formidable. So to me, what you need is basically whatever kind of composition they might be, and there are military specialists who can debate this, BCTs, brigades, divisions, corps, whatever. European, essentially a European NATO army, preferably, I think, that can, deny a Russian ability to go into NATO territory and seize and hold key territory. And so, Poland and Finland are certainly feasible. I think the Baltic states are harder, but I think with a significant German effort, that could be done. My guess is it would take much less than what the Germans, with the Federal Republic, which was then 2/3 of the size of current Germany, did in 1988. So, a lot of it is just getting back into it. The Germans say, oh, we need more time. We need more time. We don't have time. Frankly, we blew the time and you blew the time. So, because the Chinese might move. I mean, Admiral Papara was up for his confirmation hearing for Indo-PACOM commander the other day. And he pointed out 2027 is just a fourth development timeline. But that doesn't mean they're only going to go after it. They could go before it. We don't know. So we have to be, as he said, we have to be ready today, tomorrow, a year, 5 years. So the realities I'm talking about will hold. So what that means, I personally, I think NATO has come up with like a new force planning structure and all that kind of stuff. And it sounds like pretty good. The main problem with it is it's too reliant on the Americans, which if you're going to do that, for the reasons I'm telling, if they're doing that, that's a huge mistake. And it's a mistake based on information that's available to everybody. So you're building on a castle of sand. Germany should be the cornerstone. America should remain involved, in my view, heavily in certain ways, like nuclear weapons and stuff. But Europe should take the primary responsibility for its own defense.
Yeah, so basically that Germany would pay, or European countries, and Germany being the largest one, probably with then end up with the largest armed forces, completely provide for their own conventional defense, and the US would provide, in Germany's case, for example, nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some US conventional forces can be available, but I think the Europeans should essentially assume that they're basically, and, you have the Carl Bildts of the world saying that this is about, I mean, it's sort of surreal to have a Swedish prime minister lecturing us about NATO, but leaving that aside, that this is a violation of the tradition. It's like, well, if Eisenhower were to have a heart attack at the current situation, Eisenhower said it would be a huge failure if there were still American troops at all in Europe, as I think is this quote. So, this is supposed to be a partnership. If you go back to the Washington Treaty and the requirements in it, it was never supposed to be a one-way guarantee. It's partially our fault. Also Europe's. It kind of made some sense in the 1990s and 2000s. But those days are over.
Yeah, and what would interest me also is, in Germany we have politically we have a lot of centrist, center-right, center-left parties who are very much in favor of the alliance with the US, but a lot of they do is rhetoric, but they don't invest that much in defense. But then on the edges of the political spectrum, the far left and far right, we have more parties or forces, I'd say, are more critical of the US and favor more cooperation with Russia, or view the US as kind of interfering in Europe, even though the US bears a lot of the burden. What would you say, just quickly, what would you say to those kinds of?
Well, I mean, it's Germans to decide among their own. I mean, I'm a Democrat, small d, I guess it's for you to vote. But if you want to save the system, you got to do more. So all these people talking a big game about NATO and then not doing it. I mean, you had Anders Rasmussen come to Washington lecturing us about the supplemental and stuff, and it's like, well, how much does Denmark spend? How did defense spending go among the European countries while you were Secretary General, sir? How about like that? A lot less of this highfalutin rhetoric and saying how important the Americans are, which is like people in the blob in Washington benefit, but doesn't benefit regular Americans. So if you're in the center left or center right, follow through on the Zeitenwende. Sounds great. Sounds fantastic. I mean, what AKK said when she was Minister of Defense, she gave a big speech, I think in 2020. It's great. Just do it. Yeah. I mean, Germany, a friend of mine points out, Germany it's the most successful situation for Germany in its entire history. It's a secure country, recognized borders, low military spending over the last 30 years. So it seems to me you would want to perpetuate the system, but you got to do your part. I mean, it's just, I mean, we're all adults here. Come on, right? Like, we're all spending over 3% of GDP. You guys are spending 1.5 or something like that. I mean, give me a break. Like, come on, let's get real.
Yeah. Then another question going back to Asia. I think for a lot of people, probably also in America, but in Europe, it's hard to imagine seeing China and or thinking China and the US could go to war. Maybe because they assume they're both nuclear powers, and therefore it would automatically be a nuclear conflict. In the book, you lay out why it's probably going to look very different, and your proposals are obviously there to deter that from happening. But yeah, maybe can you explain a little bit how such a war would look like, and what makes that yeah, a realistic scenario?
Well, I mean, yeah, as you say, I go into my book. I mean, it's all essentially, it's informed speculation. I go into why a war is possible, more possible probably than it was during at least the later part of the Cold War, because both sides primarily assume it would be a largely conventional conflict. There might be nuclear weapons involved, but in a relatively recessed way. That's one of the reasons. But, you know, look, both sides are actively preparing for a conflict. I mean, it doesn't mean it would happen. We prepared. I mean, one of the reasons that a war didn't happen with the Soviets was because we were so prepared. But both sides are, you know, conducting large-scale exercises. It was just announced that the Japanese have identified China as their exercise enemy. So, you know, whether or not Europeans believe it can happen, it definitely can. So if you're counting on it just not happening, that's a big bet, and you could have some serious exposure if you're not ready.
And in Europe now, when it comes to Ukraine, the situation there, I would say Putin isn't able or wasn't able now to conquer the whole of Ukraine. Using your framework for the strategy of the Nile in Europe, for example, if the conflict there were to basically freeze, in your opinion, would that mean that basically the defense of Ukraine was, it was maybe not a full-on victory, but would that fit the definition of some kind of victory in your sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're different, a wide, I'm sorry, a wide variety of different outcomes in Ukraine that would be consistent with my strategy. It certainly doesn't require victory, which depending on what it means, I think is probably not realistic. General Zaluzhny wrote, I think, a pretty compelling piece in CNN over the weekend that, you know, seemed to be more realistic. I think the kind of thing that he's talking about is very consistent. But at the end of the day, and you know this from kindly reading my book, is, I mean, even a conflict in NATO, as I said, would be consistent with my strategy, because, you know, there's a whole lot of room between Ukraine or the eastern flank of NATO and the English Channel or the Rhine or whatever. You know, like, Russia is very, very far and lacks the capacity to dominate Europe. I mean, if the Russians did use force and Europe did not effectively respond in America, then I do think Germany would almost certainly rearm very quickly. So, you know, my view is, why don't you do that now and avoid the war in the first place? You probably pay a lot less. But, you know, in terms of what happens in Ukraine, you know, my position has been, I'm in favor of supporting them, the United States, at a level consistent with a genuine prioritization of Asia and China, and then, you know, helping our very close ally Israel, which is being is in a very difficult fight. And then you know, get the Europeans to step up. I mean, I haven't been saying, oh, you know, Putin is right, or the Ukrainians have to cut a deal right now. No, I'm saying, like, Europe should step up. It obviously has the economic capacity. And then, you know, the United States should kind of look to the Europeans and the Ukrainians and what they think is, you know, the best option. And we kind of take our cue from there. And you can understand what we're prepared, what we would be. And I think that's what's happening in our country right now. I don't know exactly what's going to happen with the supplemental or going forward or the election, but obviously the level, I think President Biden did not, and many Republican leaders really did not do Ukraine or Europe any favors by overpromising and now under-delivering. It would have been better to say, be more realistic about what the American people would be prepared to support over a long period of time, and say, look, this is now time for, we can cover for a bit, but you really got it. Instead, they said, don't worry, we'll support you as long as it takes. And now President Biden's saying, we'll support you as long as we can. It's like, well, yeah, like now they're already in the water with the sharks. Like you should have been more clear and realistic at the beginning. That would have been better for us, and would have been better for you, and certainly better for the Ukrainians.
Okay, yeah. Last question, a little bit outlook on the future. You talked about it earlier, about the time window when China could attack Taiwan. Just a little bit of speculation. When do you think it's likely in kind of next years? I think you sometimes mentioned that it's even more likely this year, maybe, than.
Well, I don't make any predictions. I think probably it becomes more likely over the course of the rest of this decade. I do think it's possible that the Chinese would move this year. I mean, I don't think any of us knows what Xi Jinping's really thinking. So I think their military is, has clearly been improving even in the last few years. So if you're Xi Jinping, you maybe you decide to wait when your military is in better shape. On the other hand, the German high command opposed going to war in 1939, but Hitler said, well, you're never going to be readier, the economy's never going to be readier, and the Allies are going to be better armed. So we're going to go now. And unfortunately, he was right. So we don't know. But what Admiral Paparo said is correct. It's got to be ready today, tomorrow, a year, 5 years.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.